still remember the exact moment my father's words cut through me like a blade. "Your Honor, my daughter has never amounted to anything. She's living off government handouts, contributing nothing to society." His voice echoed through the courtroom with such conviction that I felt every eye in the room turn toward me with a mixture of pity and judgment. The custody hearing for my younger brother had taken an ugly turn, and my father was painting me as the irresponsible sibling who couldn't provide a stable home. What he didn't know, what nobody in that sterile courtroom knew, was that I had spent the last 8 years serving my country in ways I could never openly discuss. The CIA doesn't hand out business cards or allow you to brag about your accomplishments at family dinners. My cover story was deliberately mundane, a low-level government clerk processing paperwork in a forgotten office building in Langley. It was boring enough that people stopped asking questions, which was exactly the point. I sat there in my modest gray suit, the kind you'd expect a struggling bureaucrat to wear, watching my father destroy my character with surgical precision. He had always been disappointed in me, especially after I dropped out of Harvard Law to join what he believed was some dead-end government job. "She makes barely $30,000 a year," he continued, waving dismissively in my direction. "How can someone like that provide for a teenage boy? My son needs stability, not charity cases." The judge, the Honorable Margaret Chen, listened patiently while scribbling notes. She was a stern woman in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and glasses that seemed to see right through people's pretenses. I had researched her extensively before this hearing, old habits from my intelligence training, and knew she had a reputation for being thorough and fair, but also unforgiving toward those who wasted her time with lies or half-truths. My stepmother sat beside my father, nodding along with his character assassination. She had never liked me, viewing me as a reminder of his first marriage. My brother Jake, now 15, and caught in the middle of this custody battle, kept glancing between us with confusion and hurt in his eyes. He was the only family member who had never judged me for my choices, probably because he was too young to understand the disappointment I had apparently caused. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, someone who had spent years protecting national security, gathering intelligence in hostile territories, and making split-second decisions that could affect international relations, being dismissed as worthless by the man who raised me. I had medals locked away in a safe deposit box that I could never display, commendations from directors whose names would never appear in public records, and a salary that would make my father's successful law practice look modest by comparison. But in that moment, sitting in family court while my character was being systematically demolished, I felt like that little girl again, the one who could never quite measure up to her father's impossible standards. The weight of maintaining my cover story, of letting people believe I was exactly what I appeared to be, had never felt heavier than it did right then. The custody battle had started 6 months earlier, when my father decided that Jake would be better off living with him and my stepmother full-time. My mother had passed away 3 years ago from cancer, and in her will, she had specifically requested that I become Jake's guardian if anything happened to her. She knew my father's controlling nature better than anyone, having endured 22 years of marriage with him before their divorce when I was in high school. My father had initially seemed accepting of the arrangement, probably because he was busy building his new life with Patricia, his second wife who was only 8 years older than me. But as Jake grew more independent and started questioning my father's rigid rules, the tension in their household became unbearable. Jake would call me late at night, whispering about arguments over his grades, his friends, his future career plans. My father wanted him to follow the same path I had rejected: Harvard, law school, joining his prestigious firm. Jake wanted to study computer science and maybe work in cybersecurity, which my father viewed as playing with computers rather than a real profession. The breaking point came when Jake got a B+ in AP history instead of his usual A. My father's reaction was so severe that Jake showed up at my apartment in Arlington at 2 a.m, having taken 3 buses to get there. He had a bruise on his shoulder and wouldn't talk about how it happened, but the fear in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. That's when I decided to file for custody, despite knowing it would mean exposing myself to exactly this kind of scrutiny. My father's legal team had been ruthless in their character assassination campaign. They had painted a picture of me as an aimless government drone who lived paycheck to paycheck in a cramped apartment, with no prospects for advancement and no stability to offer a growing teenager. They had even brought up my brief engagement to Marcus, a fellow operative who had been killed in Syria 2 years ago, suggesting that my inability to maintain relationships was evidence of my fundamental instability. What they couldn't know was that my cramped apartment was actually a carefully chosen location 3 blocks from CIA headquarters, that my dead-end job required security clearances most people couldn't dream of obtaining, and that my failed relationship had ended not because of my shortcomings, but because Marcus had died protecting an asset whose intelligence had prevented a terrorist attack in London. The financial records they had subpoenaed showed exactly what my cover identity was supposed to show: a GS-11 government employee making $32,000 a year, living modestly, with standard government benefits. They had no access to my real financial information, which was classified and compartmentalized through a complex system of shell accounts and security protocols. As far as the public record was concerned, I was exactly what my father claimed: a disappointment who had squandered her potential and was now barely scraping by. But Judge Chen had requested additional documentation for today's hearing, including a sealed financial affidavit that would be reviewed in chambers. My handler at the agency had worked for weeks to prepare a version that would reveal enough truth to help my case without compromising national security. I just hoped it would be enough to save Jake from the toxic environment my father called home. As my father concluded his devastating testimony, Judge Chen adjusted her glasses and looked directly at me. "Ms. Richardson, I'd like to hear your response to these allegations about your financial stability and ability to provide for your brother." Her tone was neutral, but I caught something in her eyes. Perhaps curiosity about the discrepancies she had already noticed in the sealed documents. I stood slowly, my hands steady despite the storm of emotions churning inside me. 8 years of field training had taught me to compartmentalize, to function under pressure when lives depended on clarity of thought. "Your Honor, I understand my father's concerns appear valid based on the limited information available to him. However, I believe there are significant misunderstandings about my actual circumstances." My father scoffed audibly. "Misunderstandings? Sarah, you've been living in Fantasyland for years. We all know exactly what your life looks like." Judge Chen raised her hand for silence, her gaze never leaving my face. "Please continue, Ms. Richardson. I'm particularly interested in addressing the financial concerns raised by your father's counsel." This was the moment I had been dreading and hoping for simultaneously. My handler had given me specific parameters for what I could reveal, carefully crafted phrases that would hint at the truth without violating my oath of secrecy. "Your Honor, my father is correct that my public employment records show a GS-11 salary of approximately $32,000 annually. However, those records represent only a portion of my actual compensation structure." The courtroom fell silent, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning system. My father's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Morrison, who had been my father's partner for 15 years, leaned forward with obvious skepticism. Jake's eyes widened slightly. He was smart enough to sense that something significant was happening, even if he couldn't understand exactly what. "The nature of my government position requires certain security protocols that limit what information can be made publicly available," I continued, choosing each word carefully. "With the court's permission, I would like to request that the sealed financial documentation already submitted be reviewed and considered as evidence of my actual ability to provide for my brother." My father's face had shifted from smug confidence to confusion. He exchanged glances with Morrison, who was frantically shuffling through papers. "Your Honor," Morrison interjected, "we weren't made aware of any sealed financial documents. The discovery process should have included all relevant financial information." Judge Chen's expression remained impassive, but I noticed her fingers drumming once against her desk, a small tell that suggested she was processing something significant. "Mr. Morrison, the sealed documentation was submitted directly to the court under federal security protocols. Your client's daughter works for an agency that requires certain classifications be maintained even in civilian legal proceedings." The weight of her words settled over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. My stepmother's mouth fell open slightly, and my father's confident posture began to crumble as the implications became clear. Jake looked between us with growing understanding, his expression shifting from confusion to something that might have been pride. "I think," Judge Chen continued, her voice carrying new authority, "it's time we examined the complete picture of Ms. Richardson's circumstances. This court will recess for 30 minutes while I review the classified financial breakdown in chambers." As Judge Chen disappeared into her chambers with the sealed documents, The courtroom erupted into hushed whispers and urgent conversations. My father immediately cornered Morrison, their voices low but their body language screaming panic. I could see the exact moment when the reality of the situation began to sink in for him. His daughter, the one he'd written off as a failure, might not be exactly who he thought she was. "Sarah," Jake whispered, sliding closer to me on the wooden bench. "What's really going on? Are you like a spy or something?" His teenage mind was connecting dots faster than I was comfortable with, but I couldn't lie to him anymore. Not when his future hung in the balance. "I can't discuss the details, Jake, but yes, my job is more complicated than it appears," I said quietly, keeping my voice low enough that the court reporter couldn't catch every word. "I've been protecting you by keeping it simple, but maybe that was a mistake." Patricia, my stepmother, had gone completely pale and was frantically texting someone, probably her sister, who loved gossip more than oxygen. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was about to become the source of the most interesting story at her country club, even though she'd never be able to share the actual details. My father broke away from Morrison and approached our bench, his usual commanding presence replaced by something I'd rarely seen from him: uncertainty. "Sarah, what exactly have you been doing all these years? And don't give me some vague answer about paperwork." "Dad, you know I can't discuss classified information, even with family," I replied, maintaining the professional tone I'd perfected over years of briefings and debriefings. "What I can tell you is that your assumptions about my career and financial situation have been incomplete." The 30 minutes felt like hours. Morrison kept checking his phone and making hushed calls to what I assumed were contacts at his firm, probably trying to figure out how badly they'd miscalculated. My father paced near the windows, occasionally shooting glances in my direction that mixed confusion with what might have been grudging respect. Jake sat beside me, processing everything with the kind of intensity only teenagers could muster when their entire worldview was shifting. When Judge Chen finally returned, her expression was carefully neutral, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she'd seen something significant in those documents. She settled behind her bench and spent a long moment organizing her papers before looking up at the assembled parties. After reviewing the sealed financial documentation, she began, her voice carrying new weight. "I find that the court's understanding of Ms. Richardson's circumstances requires substantial revision. The compensation structure detailed in the classified materials presents a dramatically different picture of her financial stability and career trajectory." My father's lawyer stood quickly, clearly scrambling. "Your Honor, without access to these documents, we cannot properly respond to or challenge this evidence. This seems highly irregular. Mr. Morrison, the irregularity lies in your client's incomplete understanding of his daughter's actual circumstances," Judge Chen replied sharply. "The federal security protocols governing this information are not subject to standard discovery rules. However, I can share certain general conclusions that bear directly on this custody determination." The tension in the room was suffocating. Jake gripped my hand tightly, and I could feel his pulse racing through his palm. Judge Chen lifted the sealed document, her reading glasses catching the fluorescent courtroom lights. "Ms. Richardson's actual annual compensation, including classified allowances and hazard pay differentials, totals $437,000. The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. My father's face went completely white, and Morrison dropped his pen with a loud clatter that echoed through the sudden silence. "Furthermore," Judge Chen continued, consulting her notes, "her security clearance level and specialized training indicate employment in a critical national security capacity, requiring extensive psychological evaluation, ongoing fitness assessments, and demonstrated reliability under extreme stress conditions. These are not characteristics typically associated with unstable individuals incapable of providing appropriate guardianship." Jake's grip on my hand tightened to the point of pain, but I barely noticed. Years of maintaining operational security had trained me to show no emotion, but inside, I felt a mixture of relief and vindication that was almost overwhelming. My father stood frozen beside Morrison's table, his mouth opening and closing without sound, like a fish pulled from water. "Your Honor," Morrison managed weakly, "we had no knowledge of these circumstances. Our client was operating under the information available to him as Ms. Richardson's father." "That raises an interesting question, Mr. Morrison," Judge Chen replied, her tone growing sharper. "If Mr. Richardson was genuinely concerned about his daughter's welfare and fitness as a guardian. Why did he not make any effort to understand her actual circumstances before initiating these proceedings? The sealed documents indicate that Ms. Richardson has been employed in her current capacity for 8 years. 8 years during which her father apparently made no genuine attempt to understand her life or career. My father finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Sarah never told us. She said she processed paperwork. She lived in that small apartment, drove an old car. His voice trailed off as the implications became clear. Every detail he'd used to build his case against me had been carefully constructed misdirection, standard operational security that he'd mistaken for failure. Mr. Richardson, Judge Chen said, removing her glasses and fixing him with a stare that could have frozen water. Your daughter's living arrangements and lifestyle choices were dictated by federal security requirements, not financial limitations. The small apartment you referenced is located in one of the most expensive areas of Arlington, specifically chosen for its proximity to her workplace and security considerations. Her vehicle and other lifestyle choices reflect operational necessity, not poverty. Patricia was crying now, whether from embarrassment or the realization that she'd spent years looking down on someone who earned more than she and my father combined. I couldn't tell. Jake was staring at me with something approaching awe, and I could practically see him recalculating every interaction we'd ever had through this new lens. The court finds, Judge Chen announced, that the petitioner's case was built on fundamentally flawed assumptions about Ms. Richardson's character, stability, and financial capacity. More concerning is the apparent lack of genuine effort to understand or support his daughter's actual circumstances over the past 8 years. My father sank into his chair as if his legs had given out. The man who had spent decades building cases on facts and evidence had just watched his own case crumble because he'd never bothered to look beyond the surface of his own daughter's life. Judge Chen set down her papers and looked directly at my father, her expression shifting from judicial neutrality to something closer to disappointment. Mr. Richardson, before I render my final decision on custody, I need to address a troubling pattern that has emerged during these proceedings. Your testimony today wasn't just inaccurate. It was deliberately cruel and dismissive toward your own daughter. My father's face crumpled as the full weight of his actions began to sink in. Your Honor, I thought I was protecting Jake. I believed Sarah was struggling, that she couldn't provide. You believed what you chose to believe, Judge Chen interrupted sharply. The evidence suggests you made no genuine effort to understand your daughter's life or circumstances. Instead, you constructed a narrative that supported your predetermined conclusion. That's not protection, Mr. Richardson. That's control. Jake suddenly stood up beside me, his teenage voice cracking with emotion. He's lying, Your Honor. He knew Sarah was successful. He had to know. Every head in the courtroom turned toward him, and I felt my heart sink as I realized what was coming. Last Christmas, when Sarah gave me that new laptop for school, Dad saw the receipt in my backpack. It was like $3,000. He asked me where I really got it, said there was no way Sarah could afford something like that on her salary. The courtroom fell deadly silent. My father's face went from pale to gray, and Morrison looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Judge Chen's expression hardened further, if that was even possible. Continue, Jake, she said gently, but her eyes never left my father's face. And the time Sarah took me to that fancy restaurant in Georgetown for my birthday last year. Dad saw the pictures I posted and asked how she could afford to eat there. He said she must be in debt, living beyond her means, but he never asked her directly. He just assumed the worst and told everyone she was irresponsible with money. Jake's voice was getting stronger, more confident as he spoke. He's been telling Patricia's family for years that Sarah was a disappointment, that she threw away her education for nothing. Even when I tried to tell him about the cool places Sarah would take me, or how she always seemed to know things about world events before they were on the news, he'd just say I was being naive. My father finally looked at me, really looked at me, for what felt like the first time in years. The expression on his face was one I'd never seen before, a mixture of shame, regret, and dawning realization. Sarah, God, what have I done? But it was too late for apologies. The damage had been done, not just in this courtroom, but over years of dismissal and judgment. Judge Chen was making notes again, her pen moving quickly across the paper. When she looked up, her decision was already clear in her eyes. Mr. Richardson, Your son's testimony suggests that you had multiple opportunities to reassess your assumptions about your daughter's circumstances, yet you chose instead to maintain a narrative that served your own purposes. This court finds that pattern of behavior deeply concerning, particularly in the context of your fitness as a guardian. The crisis wasn't just about custody anymore. It was about the fundamental breakdown of trust in our family, and whether any of these relationships could ever be repaired. Judge Chen set down her pen and clasped her hands together, the gesture carrying the weight of finality. This court has heard enough testimony to render a decision on the custody matter before us today. However, before I announce my ruling, I want to address the broader implications of what has transpired in this courtroom. The silence was deafening. My father sat hunched forward in his chair, his expensive suit somehow making him look smaller rather than more authoritative. Patricia had stopped crying but kept dabbing at her eyes with tissues, leaving black streaks of mascara on the white paper. Morrison was frantically scribbling notes, probably already thinking about damage control and appeals. "Mr. Richardson," Judge Chen continued, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "You came into my courtroom today prepared to destroy your daughter's character based on assumptions you never bothered to verify. You painted her as a failure, a burden on society, someone incapable of providing for a teenage boy. You did this not to protect your son, but to justify taking him away from the guardian his mother specifically chose." Jake was trembling beside me, his hand still gripping mine. I could feel his pulse hammering against my palm, and I squeezed gently, trying to offer what comfort I could, while my own world shifted around us. The sealed financial documents reveal that Ms. Richardson earns more in a single year than most families see in a decade, but more importantly, they reveal someone who has dedicated her life to serving her country in ways that require extraordinary sacrifice, discretion, and personal integrity. These are not the characteristics of someone who would be careless with a child's welfare. My father finally raised his head, and I saw tears streaming down his face. "Your Honor, please. I made a terrible mistake. I let my pride, my disappointment in choices I didn't understand, cloud my judgment. But I love Jake. I love both my children." "Love is not enough, Mr. Richardson," Judge Chen replied sharply. "Love without respect, without trust, without the basic courtesy of trying to understand the people you claim to care about, is not the foundation for healthy relationships. Your son has been watching this dynamic for years, seeing how you treat his sister, learning what kind of man you expect him to become." Jake suddenly released my hand and stood up again, his voice stronger than before. "I don't want to live with him anymore, Your Honor. I want to stay with Sarah. She's never lied to me, never made me feel small or stupid when I didn't meet some impossible standard. She listens when I talk about my dreams instead of telling me they're worthless." The words hit my father like physical blows. He doubled over slightly, pressing his hands to his face, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt something approaching pity for him. He had built his entire identity around being right, being successful, being in control, and now he was watching it all crumble because he had never learned to see beyond his own expectations. "This court awards full custody of Jake Richardson to his sister, Sarah Richardson," Judge Chen announced, her words echoing through the courtroom with absolute finality. "Furthermore, given the concerning patterns of behavior demonstrated today, I am ordering supervised visitation only, pending completion of family counseling for Mr. Richardson." The gavel came down with a sound like thunder, and everything changed forever. The courtroom erupted in a chaos of emotions and voices, but I felt strangely calm, as if I were watching everything unfold from a great distance. Jake immediately wrapped his arms around me, his teenage frame shaking with relief and residual adrenaline. "Thank you," he whispered against my shoulder, and I realized he wasn't just thanking me for fighting for him, but for years of being the stable presence in his life when everything else felt uncertain. My father remained hunched in his chair, Morrison's hand on his shoulder, in what looked more like restraint than comfort. Patricia had gathered her purse and was already heading toward the exit, her heels clicking rapidly against the marble floor. She paused at the door, shooting me a look that mixed resentment with something that might have been grudging respect, before disappearing into the hallway. I suspected this would be the last time I'd see her, and I found I was perfectly fine with that. Judge Chen was gathering her papers, but she caught my eye before standing. "Ms. Richardson, your brother is fortunate to have someone willing to sacrifice so much for his well-being. The court trusts you'll continue to provide the guidance and stability he needs." Her words carried weight beyond the legal formalities, a recognition of the years I'd spent building trust with Jake while maintaining the careful balance of my double life. As we prepared to leave, my father finally stood and approached us slowly, his movements uncertain and aged. Jake tensed beside me, but didn't move away. "Sarah," my father said, his voice hoarse from crying, "I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness. I know I've destroyed something that might never be repaired. But please, don't let my failures poison Jake against the idea of family entirely." I looked at this man, who had shaped so much of my early life, who had driven me to excel even as he'd made me feel like nothing I did would ever be enough. The anger I'd carried for years felt different now, less sharp, more like a dull ache that might eventually heal. "Dad, Jake will always know he has family who love him, but love has to be demonstrated, not just declared. You'll have to figure out how to do that." Jake surprised me by stepping forward slightly. "Maybe we can try the counseling thing," he said quietly, his voice carrying a maturity that reminded me he'd been forced to grow up faster than most kids his age. "But things have to be different. Really different." My father nodded frantically, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time that day. "Yes, whatever it takes. I'll do whatever it takes." As we walked out of the courthouse into the bright Virginia afternoon, Jake asked the question I'd been dreading. "So what happens now? Do you have to quit your job because people know?" I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in months. "Actually, Jake, having you live with me officially might make things easier. My handler's been saying I need better cover for why I'm never available for weekend social events. Having a teenage brother to look after is perfect." He grinned, and for the first time in years, I felt like our family might actually survive this. Different than before, but maybe stronger for having faced the truth. You know, this story touched me deeply, and I know it touched you too. It's about family, about hidden truths, about how sometimes the people we love most are the ones who know us least. Look, I know almost nobody subscribes to the channel. Most people just listen and leave. But if this story made you feel something, if it made you think about your own family, your own unspoken truths, all I need is that little subscribe button. It's free, takes 1 second, and it's the only way I know these stories are reaching the right people. Please, just hit subscribe. It means everything.